They assumed that it was damaged, came under attack, and sank with all hands. Meanwhile, the Americans were able to board the submarine and capture important code books and documents, and they actually captured a working Enigma machine from the sub. So that helped a lot. Also, the U-110 was another vessel, and when the boarders, when the naval personnel boarded the sub, they removed about 50 of the large mail bags that you see, the large canvas sacks, 50 of those full of code documents relating to the Enigma machine. So that was the system. This was actually one that was smashed by a rifle, by a German rifle, and then they threw it into a lake. This was actually, I think this was in France, but they managed to destroy the machine, and then this was later recovered by divers about 5 years ago. So that's it. If anyone has any questions, I'll this is the equipment that I brought here is German radio equipment. This is what they would have used in the field for sending and receiving their messages from the Enigmas.
Question? Hello?
Yes. Yeah.
What type of coding was done by the Allies?
The Allies, that's a good question. The Allies used a machine that was similar to the Enigma machine. It used rotors. It was called the M209 machine. And it was a small device that you could carry into the field. It had a canvas bag, and it printed the encoded message on a paper strip, which was then given to the radio operator. They used larger machines as well, but they all pretty much worked on the same rotor principle. There were also hand ciphers that were used that were sort of a pencil and paper design using columns and rows. They also used that rotating disc system, the M94, which I showed earlier.
Follow-up?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, if they intercept messages, how did they get to the point where the Germans didn't know that they were doing this? I mean, they were obviously heading off some attacks here and there.
Right.
And the Germans must have suspected something, so...
Yes. One of the myths about breaking the Enigma code was basically that there was this, Alan Turing came to England, or came to Bletchley Park, built a Turing bomb, and broke the code, and that was it. That was, from then on until the end of the war, they were reading all the traffic. It was sort of a cat and mouse kind of game between the Allies and the Germans with their code breaking, or lack of code breaking knowledge. The Germans would develop a system, the Allies would break it, either through captured documents, interception of messages, that sort of thing. And then the Germans would develop something else. They would change the rotor wiring, they would change the way that they sent their messages. I talked about the double encipherment, where they would send the key letters twice for the rotors. They stopped doing that. They would only send it once. Earlier in the war, when they would send a message, the receiving station would then send a message back to the transmitting station to make sure there were no mistakes. That was easy to break because you had the same message twice, so then you had two different codes that they used, and you could mathematically solve it that way. It was, again, this cat and mouse. But ultimately, the more machines and the more equipment they had to break the code, the easier it was.
They were still using the same idea of the Enigma machine.
Yes, they were still using the Enigma system. And by the end of the war, code breaking was down to about an hour lapse between receiving the message and instantly breaking it within an hour's time. Sometimes even before the German U-boats were getting their messages and having them deciphered. So, yeah.
I understand the United States also broke the Japanese code.
Purple, yes.
Could you comment about that?
Okay. The purple system, originally the prototypes for the purple system go back to the Enigma. They use rotors. It almost looks like basically a similar version of the Enigma machine. They were a bit smaller, but they had a standard keyboard, and lamp output, but they used a system of rotors. So mathematically and cryptologically, it's essentially the same. But prior to the war, they did capture code books, and they did capture keys, which enabled them to further break down their encipherment methods.
Did the Japanese get that technology from the Germans?
Well, yes. The rotor technology goes back to Arthur Scherbius.
Oh, okay.
So it all trails back to him. but then they developed in their own use. But they did not use it commercially. It was specifically for military use, whereas the Germans originally built it for private industry, so, and then it branched out. So, questions?
You saw these bombs and
Mhm.
everything was moving forward. When
Right.
they found something, what happened?
The machine stopped. The switches, the rotating switches would connect together and complete the circuit, and they would stop. Then an operator would go over and write down those numbers, and then they were plugged into another, an actual Enigma machine that they had, and they would test it to see if it made any sense. If it didn't make any sense, they ran it through again and tried different possibilities.
Okay.
So,
So it ran until it found something.
right.
What type of systems are being used nowadays?
Now, most all the encryption systems today are electronic. They have random letter generating systems that develop strings of code that then further encode it along with other strands of randomly selected letters and
Breakable?
numbers. So it's mostly done by computers, software programs.
Is it breakable?
Well, like everything else, it's breakable if you have access to the keys and you can steal enough information.
Did the Allied coders get broken by the Germans?
The Germans did not mount they did not put the same amount of effort into code breaking that the Allies did. There were a few areas where they worked on it, but it was not considered important as far as military efforts. You know,
Same
so-
with the Japanese.
right. So the Allies really made sort of a widespread effort. You know, everyone was working on it, you know, to try to break the code. And it was, like I said, a number of different opportunities and clues that were obtained to do that along the way.
I have a question. In watching the Imitation Game and then reading the story of Alan Turing, I realized that the movie was not necessarily all true.
Right.
There was something in the movie, though, where somebody had an aha moment saying there was always high at the end of a...
That was, yes. That is a story, yes. And there is some evidence to prove that is in fact true. All of the radio messages that were sent ended in Heil Hitler. They would send HH, okay? And one way that spies were double agents, they were British agents working in Germany, had been turned by the Germans, now they're working for the Germans, but the British still think they're working for them. The British operator would simply end his message with HH, and the other operator, without even thinking, would send HH back. And that was a dead giveaway that he'd been compromised, so that he'd been over there sending German messages. And that's a story that I've heard from a couple of different historians. But the Germans, one thing the Germans did do, though, they had a large direction-finding network. Because if you were a spy in Germany, you usually had a suitcase. It was a radio disguised as a suitcase, and that was your communication apparatus to communicate with your home base in France or in England, if you're working with the underground in France. And the Germans would had listening posts set up, and they had portable radio equipment that they could take, and they could triangulate the position of where these transmitters were, and then call up the Gestapo and have them raid the building or the block where they thought the spy was, and try to find the radio and arrest them. So they did do a lot of that. Yeah.
Did the Germans realize that their codes were being broken?
Not until the very end of the war. And surprisingly, well, there's a surprising number of men that didn't know that their machine was that it was even breakable until years later, when books are written about it, in the 1970s, 1980s, that's when it started to come out in England. People that had worked on it started to slowly, publish, and as late as 1983, people in Britain were still being pursued by the law and by security agencies to not disclose information about it. And I believe it was 1981, the first public book really came out that exposed, yeah.
Enigma was very successful relative to the submarine.
Right.
When the Germans had the bulge,
Mhm.
battle of the bulge, we didn't know about it.
Right.
And so either they understood or they recognized it just, they were close to just sending it by hand. or don't
Right.
use it.
Well, the problem was with, in the case of the Army, most of the equipment that they were using, the radio equipment, was short-range radio equipment. to send messages, between units. Hardly any of the messages were being sent for, say, to Berlin and back and forth, in longer scale. So to actually be able to intercept the messages, it was just more difficult in that case. So that sort of minimized the.
I've heard it said that even though Allied forces had broken the Enigma code, British intelligence was reluctant to act on the information they had because it did not want to know the code had been broken.
Right.
Any idea if that's true?
Well, that is an ongoing argument between historians. Some historians say just because there's a lack of evidence for something doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And there's other historians that have researched the archives. The archives where most of this information is placed were only recently declassified. So it'll probably be another 20 or 30 years before that question is answered. One of the stories that you're referring to is the bombing of Coventry, the village of Coventry. They said that the British government knew about it, that the Germans were going to launch an attack and bomb the village, but they didn't want to divulge it, and warn the citizens to take cover, because the Germans would then know that they were ready for the attack, that they had read the code.
That was in one of Churchill's books.
Yes. So. Okay. Yeah.
That movie, I think it was U-571,
Mhm.
where the
Yeah.
Allied forces get the Enigma machine and they capture it from a
Right.
U-boat. And so is that actually somewhat historically?
It's loosely based on the U-505 that was captured. They depth charged the sub until it surfaced. The crew safely evacuated the ship, and they set demolition charges to go off. But boarders, U.S. Navy boarders, were able, and I think there was some British involved as well, were able to board the sub and disarm the charges before they went off and salvage documents and the Enigma from the sub. And that was the one that was towed back to the United States and then to the Bahamas.
And is now in Chicago if
Yes.
anyone wants to see
Yes.
Yes, it's now at the Museum of Science and Industry.
Yes.
So you can actually walk through it. And,
I heard that American Indian language was used.
That's correct.
yes, starting in the First World War, the U.S. government basically recruited Native Americans to use their native languages to send messages as a sort of unbreakable code. Many of the languages are taught, and they're not written languages, so you can't go to a library and check out a book, and be able to decipher your messages unless you're a Native American in that particular tribe. And there's a lot of variance in the languages from tribe to tribe. So that's, and then in World War II, they used the
Minimal use in the Pacific.
right. There were Navajos for the most part in World War II that were used. I mean, there were a few other tribes, but mostly the Navajo.
They were just recently recognized, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Several of them got accommodations from the government. But a little bit about the equipment here. This is what would have been used by the Germans in the field. This is a German shortwave receiver. There's a German shortwave transceiver, and these were all designed to fit together into backpacks that could be worn by soldiers that would march into the field carrying these, and then set up in the field for portable operation. And the transceiver here is wired to send and receive in either voice or Morse code. There was a small hand mic you could use for sending voice and a Morse code key. And I've also, in the case in the front here, I've got an actual Enigma rotor, which I showed a bit earlier. This is an actual rotor out of an Enigma machine. And you can see the numbers on the outside of the wheel there, and then the contacts.
How many combinations?
Well, modern mathematicians put the number of possible combinations using a late war Enigma machine at about 10 billion. So, because there were about 60 different ways you could just put 3 rotors on the machine and wire them up with the set that was supplied.
How long did it take you to build yours?
Oh, well, I'm still working on it. I started about 5 years ago. So, but I did build the transceiver on the end here. I built that from scratch, The faceplate is actually cast off of an original. Many of the parts that I used, this I restored. Many of the parts that I used in the restoration were found at archaeological sites. Some of the parts came from different battlefields across Europe. The parts are excavated, cleaned, and then restored. So you're welcome to come up and see some of that. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Wow.
I think if you want, maybe a little bit at a time, if you come up, you demonstrate how the Enigma worked as people come up and see as you pass by to look at the equipment. He'll show you how the Enigma actually worked. It's pretty simple, but to decode it's the hard part. Don't forget there's refreshments yet here in the hallway after we're finished here. The thing that I think about is the Roman army was unstoppable. The Titanic was unsinkable. The Enigma code was unbreakable, right? All three things, huh? There you are. So Robert, thank you. Yeah, come look at the equipment here. He also did, not only the German part, but he did the communications, the U.S. communications bunker over here also. So that's his equipment over there also, so.
And the tent?
Very good. And the tent, yeah, we sleep in that at night. Night at the museum, yeah, we're in there. Thank you all for coming. And you come up, he'll show you a little bit more.